Well, welcome everybody. It's the first Sunday in December. Good to see everybody here, and we welcome everybody who's watching online. We hope that your holiday season, is off to a good start. Anyway, we're continuing our survey of the book of First Samuel. We're at chapter 13. If you'd like to turn there in your Bibles or on your tablets or phone. Anyway, we've been studying about King Saul. This little series of lessons that I've been calling Better Call Saul. I'll continue to do that until the other Better Call Saul sues me for copyright infringement. Anyway, so far Saul's been off to a good start. What we know about him from the earliest accounts was Israel wanted a king. And God gave him a king. Israel wanted a king basically for ungodly reasons, not because, hey, I think this is what God wants us to have, but no, give us a king because every other nation has a king. And, God's not, the implied criticism is God is not doing right by us by not giving us a king. So God tells Samuel, they're going to have a king. They want a king. They'll give them a king. We'll give them the type of king that they're deserving of. And they have it in King Saul. I mean, if you were casting a movie about this and, hiring someone out of Central Casting, Saul looked like the character straight out of Central Casting for being a king. He was taller heads and shoulders above most other folks in the region. He was good looking. He basically made waves wherever he went because he was so distinguished looking. And last week we saw where, he seemed to be getting off to a good start. He seemed to be humble. He basically went back and waited for directions from the Lord, from Samuel. That came in the way of a challenge in one of the cities that was about to be invaded and taken over by enemies. He responds to that challenge, and God rewards that. He is exceedingly victorious. And so much so that the country that was kind of tentative about, he looks the part, but can he play the part? Yeah, he can play the part. We want him. We love him. His approval ratings went up to probably 90% at that time, 98%. He was set as a king, and that's great. But time goes on. And of course, we know that in life, it's not if, but when certain challenges come up that test your mettle and basically test what your character is like, who you are. And this happens to Saul, as we're about to see in the lesson today. Excuse me. As we open up chapter 13, we're going to look at two chapters today that reveal a lot about Saul's character that we need to know about. Because as we've probably learned in our own life experiences, someone who looks good, someone who looks the part, doesn't always live up to your expectations of what they're supposed to be doing. So as we go into and open chapter 13, the narrative says that Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. That's according to most translations. Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. 2,000 were with him at Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah. Gibeah is Saul's home base. The rest of the men he sent back to their homes. Apparently, these 3,000 men are the A-team. Basically, Saul says, this is the best of the best. They're the elite. They're my posse. Wherever I go, they go, and they will take care of whatever challenges come up. And that's a significant aspect because one thing we need to keep in mind, yes, Israel finally has a king, but Israel is not totally free and independent nation. It's still under the thumb of several other tribes and clans. Uh, Biggest among them, the Philistines. And we learned a little bit about the Philistines last week. That when if we want to think about somebody who's rude and crude and barbarian, and somebody you not necessarily on your A list to have over for dinner, the Philistines kind of describe those people. Well, the Philistines may have been rude and crude and barbarian, but they were also technologically advanced because, thanks to their relatives over in Greece and Crete, they were able to import a lot of military technology like chariots, all sorts of fighting equipment and utensils. So they were a significant force to deal with, especially for the people of Israel, who, at least by human military standards, were kind of a backward country. So, yeah, Israel had a king, but Israel was not independent. Israel was not free. Israel was under the thumb of the Philistines. And it was kind of it was not too brutal a relationship, because after all, Israel had learned to be, was one of those periods where the people had learned to be subservient. Okay, if we don't make waves, if we don't irritate you or anything like that, will you leave us alone? And by and large, the Philistines did, other than occasionally raiding their crops and taking food and stealing stuff that looked attractive to them. But otherwise, they got along, such to the degree that you could get along in a situation like that. Well, eventually, the issue is, what are we going to do about those crazy Philistines? And finally, Saul's son, Jonathan, decides to do something about it. Jonathan, verse 3, attacked the Philistine outpost at Geba. Geba. Now, some translations say that's actually Gibeah, and this gives you an idea about what kind of relationship the Israelites and the Philistines had if this was an outpost at Gibeah, because Gibeah was also Saul's home base. Things were so aligned with them that, hey, we can be next door to the man they call a king, and everybody gets along. And as long as everybody behaves themselves, we're good with that. But hey, look, the king's son has attacked the local outpost. The Philistines heard about it. Saul had the trumpet blown throughout the land and said, "Let the Hebrews hear." So all Israel heard the news. And here's the official pronouncement. Saul has attacked the Philistine outpost. Really? We thought it was Jonathan. Maybe the way the guy announced it was, well, the household, the kingship of Saul, the household of Saul, the administration, Saul's administration has finally taken matters into its own hand. It may have been that, because after all, anyone who does anything under the auspices of a king, well, you're basically the king's agent here. So that may be one reason why it's announced this way. Might also be that Saul's ego is a little bit in the way. Well, I don't want to say that my son did this, so just tell everybody I did it. So Saul has attacked the Philistine outpost, and now Israel has become obnoxious to the Philistines. Oh, yeah. Up to this point, the Philistines were happy to get along with the Israelites. They behaved themselves, minded their P's and Q's, didn't get uppity, you know what I mean? But hey, we can't have any of this attack on our one attack on an outpost. If we let that go, what's going to happen? It's just going to get worse. So the Philistines respond and are going to respond. And in anticipation of that, Saul's issuing basically a muster order. Hey, we need volunteers here. And the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. Remember, Gilgal is that city in Israel where important things have happened. Gilgal is where Saul was made king and recoronated king. So any kind of important event, Saul's basically mode of operation is, let's go to Gibeah and make it happen. While they're doing that, verse 5, the Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots. Chariots are something that the Israelites don't have, much less charioteers. 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. That's one way of saying there were so many we don't know how to count them. We stopped at what? 53,643, and we're not even sure of that number. More people than you can shake a stick at. So many people, they probably overran the local Dairy Queen. That was that was just that was the worst day in the week to go and try to get a shake or something. But in other words, there were a lot of people here, and at least more people than the Israelites had. What are we going to do? Not only that, the Philistines went up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth Aven. That's significant because Michmash is located high on a mountain. And from Michmash, from their location, the Philistines can look out and see everything that's happening below, all the Israelite encampments. Not only that, if anybody wants to engage the Philistines in battle, they're going to have a very, very steep climb. They're almost in an impregnable position. The Philistines basically are saying, hey guys, we own you. You want to make trouble, we'll make this the worst day of your life. And the message carries. Verse 6, when the Israelites saw that the situation was critical and that their army was hard pressed, they hid in caves and thickets among the rocks and in pits and cisterns. Head for the hills, everybody. The Philistines are coming, and we can't defend ourselves. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan River into the land of Gad and Gilead. Remember, there was that territory on the other side of the Jordan that the Israelites asked for, and God gave it to them. And this is the ultimate of let's get out of Dodge, folks. Let's cross the Jordan over to the other side, the really remote section of Israel, and we'll hide out there. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. No doubt, all this array of what the Philistines have lined up, and they got nothing other than each other. And so the morale is sinking quicker than a soap that doesn't know how to float. Something other than ivory. It just goes straight down to the bottom. Verse 8, Saul waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel. Apparently there was this arrangement that Saul had sent to Samuel. Hey, Samuel, come down. You need to bless our troops. Need to make an offering, make sure that we're good with God before we go out and do anything. So Samuel sends back a message that says, I'll be there in 1 week. 7 days pass. No Samuel. Saul's getting nervous. His troops are getting nervous. Apparently, there are some who are scattering. The situation is, for him, from his point of view, is getting out of control. What am I going to do? Well, one thing you could have done, or what maybe Saul could possibly have done, was go to the Lord in prayer and say, Lord, help me. Apparently, that's missing here. At least if he did, no mention is made of it. Good chance he didn't even think about going and asking for the Lord's help at all. He just panics. And so he says, verse 9, bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings. Does that sound bad on the surface? Well, what's wrong with that? What's that up? That's something that, hey, if you really want the Lord's blessing, that was the ritual. You had the priest come, or you had someone connected with the priesthood come and make the offering. And of course, Samuel is a Levite. Samuel was the most logical person to make those offerings. But he's not there. There's another little catch here. those kind of offerings were to be offered by a Levite, by a priest, not by a king, not by anyone from the civil government. That was something that God had no intention of happening. So Saul is crossing a line here. Yeah, he's panicked. He doesn't know what to do. And to compound everything, he is sinning against the Lord by doing something that is specifically off bounds or out of bounds for someone who is not a Levite or a priest. Saul offered up the burnt offering. Just as he finished making the offering, here comes Samuel. Saul went out to greet him. "What have you done?" asked Samuel. It's obvious that something's been going on. There's the aroma of the animals being offered for sacrifice. Probably even before he got to the aroma, he probably saw off in the distance the smoke that would come from such a sacrifice uh, being made on the altar. So Samuel asked that question, and it's probably not in a very friendly manner. Saul knows he's on the carpet here. So Saul replies, he says, "Oh, gee, it's all my fault. I panicked in a moment of weakness, and I have sinned against the Lord. Gee, please, please go to me and to the Lord and ask for forgiveness for my part." And everything was restored. And oh, wait a minute, that's not what happened. What Saul does in a moment of panic, in a moment of weakness, probably in a moment of anger, let the blame game begin. Saul is one of the most creative excuse machines that probably ever lived. And he is going full force on the "don't look at me, don't blame me. Yeah, I did it, but here's why. It's not my fault." And he offers 3, maybe 4 excuses for why he did what he did. "When I saw that the men were scattering, and that you did not come, you, Samuel, didn't come at the set time, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor, so I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering." So, hey, here's Saul saying, it's not my fault. It's, I had really good reasons for doing what I did. I had to do. My hand was forced. It's the men's fault. They were scattering. I was losing my soldiers. What was I going to do if I didn't have a fighting force? "Samuel, it was your fault because you said you were going to meet me in 7 days and you didn't show up. It was the Philistines' fault for making, setting up all this military hardware and all these men and making these threatening noises." And he didn't quite say this specifically, but there's a fourth entity that he blamed: God. It's even God's fault because you know how God is. We had to have the burnt offering to get his blessing. And if someone didn't do the burnt offering, God wasn't going to bless us or go with us. So I had to do what I did. Don't look at me. I'm the victim here. Well, that sounds, I guess, reasonable on a human level. It's not washing with Samuel. Verse 13. "You have done a foolish thing," Samuel said. And the word foolish in the Hebrew doesn't mean, "Oh, you silly Saul. There you go again." It's one of those Homer Simpson moments, where he goes, "Oh." No, you didn't do something that was merely silly or thoughtless. That's not what Samuel means by foolish here. Foolish is Samuel's way of saying you have deliberately disregarded and disobeyed God. You've done a foolish thing. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. Here are the consequences of your behavior, Samuel, Mr. Innocent Victim of the day. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. I'll tell you what's going to happen to you, Saul, and what you've done and what the consequences are. You're going to lose your kingdom. It's not going to be a permanent or established kingdom. The Lord is already in the process of making arrangements for your successor. That's how serious it is. Then Samuel left Gilgal, went up to Gibeah in Benjamin. And Saul counted the men who were with him. They numbered about 600. That's about 20% of what he started out with. Yeah, there's been lots and lots of desertions there. Not only that, the Philistines have made a real big show of showing that they own the situation here. Saul and his son Jonathan and the men with them were staying in Gibeah and Benjamin, while the Philistines camped at Michmash. Raiding parties went out from the Philistine camp in 3 detachments. One turned toward Ophrah and the city of Shaul, another toward Beth Horon, and the third toward the borderland overlooking the valley of Zeboim, facing the wilderness. Apparently, the raiding parties could go anywhere they wanted with impunity because the Israelites had no weapons. That was by design by the Philistines. Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plow points, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. The Philistines made one allowance. Okay, yeah, the Israelites have got a farm, and that helps us on 2 ways. Number one, we're going to raid them and get some of, or if not all of their crops. Number two, it's a profit-making venture because every time they go down to the local Philistine shop, they charge for sharpening their farm implements, and they don't make them all that sharp because I'm sure a lot of this is repeat business. The price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening plow points and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes, and for repointing goads. So on the day of battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. Sure does look hopeless, doesn't it? Well, there's one thing the Israelites have that the Philistines don't. We're fixing to find that out. Now, a detachment of Philistines had gone out to the pass at Michmash, and going into chapter 14, one day Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he didn't tell his father. Now, we don't know why. We can imagine, we can kind of speculate. Maybe Jonathan was thinking, if I ask Dad's permission, I know what he's going to say, so it's better to ask for forgiveness than for permission, that kind of thing. So, while this is going on, Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. Was that all he was doing? Just sitting under the tree, with his 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. He was the son of Ichabod's brother Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh. It's interesting that the writer makes a point of identifying who the priest was. He is the nephew of Ichabod. What does Ichabod stand for? The glory has departed from Israel. Kind of reminder of where things are with the Israelites. Not in a glorious position. No one was aware that Jonathan had left in a tribute to the superb state of alertness of the Israelite forces. Jonathan and his armor-bearer have gone, and it completely escapes their attention. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philippine outpost was a cliff. One was called Bozez and the other Sinai. One cliff stood to the north toward Michmash, the other to the south toward Geba. Jonathan said to his young armor bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men," meaning the Philistines. "Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." Now, is John acting on presumption, or is he stepping out in faith? I kind of think he's stepping out in faith, because he's kind of like, okay, I'm going to do something, but I'm going to let the Lord lead me here, and we're going to see how that goes. Verse 7, "Do all that you have in mind," his armor bearer said. "Go ahead, I am with you, heart and soul." Jonathan said, "Come on then, we will cross over toward them and let them see us." And here's the indication that he is allowing God to lead him. He's looking for a sign from God. Verse 9, "If they say to us, 'Wait there until we come to you,' we'll stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we'll climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." So both of them showed themselves to the Philippine outpost. "Look," said the Philistines, "the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they're hiding in. They're coming out to surrender." The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor bearer, "Come up to us, and we'll teach you a lesson." Just what Jonathan was looking for. Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." So Jonathan proceeds with confidence. Jonathan climbed up, using his hands and feet, with his armor bearer right behind him. Remember where Michmash is and where they are in that pass. They have to do this steep climb, this very steep climb. Highly unlikely by human standards that this is going to be a successful operation. But look at this. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. That's not bad, given the circumstances. And then God decides to send a few things to help out old Jonathan. Verse 15, "Panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and field, and those in the outpost and raiding parties. The ground shook. An earthquake. It was a panic sent by God." Saul's out looks at Gibeah in Benjamin, saw the army melting away in all directions. Then Saul said to the men who were with him, "Muster the forces and see who has left us." Suddenly, Saul is very interested in seeing, okay, who we got here. Maybe he's just, okay, the time has come to act, especially if something's happened to the Philistines. Maybe it's something we've did, go find out who it is, especially if they've gone so far as to, they might get the credit. Maybe. Anyway, they do the muster, and it turns out Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. Saul said to Ahijah the priest, "Bring the ark of God." More likely, he said, "Bring your ephod," because it's in the priestly ephod that there are these two stones called the Urim and the Thummim. And these were stones that were used to cast lots to determine what God wanted his people to do. I need to find out from God what we need to do here, what the direction is. Saul maybe has learned his lesson a little late, but maybe he's learned that, hey, maybe I need to consult with the Lord when we're doing these things. Verse 19, "While Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, 'Withdraw your hand.'" "Stand down, Ahijah. I think I know what we need to do. We don't need to consult the Lord here." Then Saul and all his men assembled and went to the battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines, apparently POWs, they'd gone up with them to their camp, went over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. So the situation has reversed. It's the Philippines who are in a panic, who are on the run. It's the Israelites who are victorious. On that day, the Lord saved Israel, and the battle moved on beyond Beth Aven. Now, the Israelites were in distress that day because Saul made a stupid oath. He had bound the people under an oath, saying, "Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies." Another episode from Saul of "It's all about me." Hey, you guys need to go out and we need to avenge myself here. Not, hey, we need to do the Lord's work. God is leading us here and we need to carry out what God has commissioned us to do. The focus from Saul is on himself, not on God. And on top of that, he makes this rash vow. I don't want anyone taking a bite of food until you have avenged me on my enemies. So none of the troops tasted food. The entire army entered the woods and there was honey on the ground. Now, this may have actually been a provision from God. God saying, hey, guys, you need nourishment here. You need something. You need some energy source to keep the battle going, which they now cannot use because of the oath that Saul has put his forces under. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth because they feared the oath. And here's where we have a little complication about that oath. Verse 27, Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath. So he reached out the end of his staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth. His eyes brightened. Then one of the soldiers told him, your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, cursed be anyone who eats food today. That's why the men are faint. Jonathan said, my father has made trouble for the country. See how my eyes brightened when I tasted a little of this honey. How much better it would have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies. Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater? Yeah. Now you can maybe critique Jonathan for criticizing the king in front of his troops, but Jonathan's critique here is pretty much spot on. Hey, Dad, bad decision, bad oath, shouldn't have done it. That day, after the Israelites had struck down the Philistines, they encounter, there's a second consequence that comes from Saul's rash oath. They were exhausted. Verse 32, they pounced on the plunder, and taking sheep, cattle, and calves, they butchered them on the ground and ate them together with the blood. Now, that sounds kind of yucky, yeah? I mean, something we wouldn't do, but, if you're hungry enough and you're desperate enough, there's no telling what you might eat, even to the point, in this case, where they violate a command of the law of Moses. Whatever you eat, do not eat the meat with the blood in it. The Mosaic law was very specific about that. You need to drain the blood from the food, from the meat, before you eat it. That's how desperately hungry they were. At the end of the day, when the battle is done, they pounce on the livestock and just eat it raw. Then someone said to Saul, look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that has blood in it. You've broken faith, Saul said. Roll a large stone over here at once. Then he said, go out among the men and tell them, each of you bring me your cattle, sheep, and slaughter them here and eat them. The idea being, yes, prepare your food properly according to Mosaic law. Let's not sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it. So everyone brought his ox that night, slaughtered it there. Then Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first time he had done this, implying that Saul is kind of late to the game in terms of taking the Lord seriously and taking God's counsel seriously and following God's requirements. Then Saul makes a decision, a military decision that has an important outcome here. He said, "Let us go down and pursue the Philistines by night, plunder them till dawn. Let us not leave one of them alive." Good idea. Your enemy's on the run. They're in a panic. This is the best time to take advantage of the situation, strike them down, get rid of everyone who's going to be a threat to you down the road. "Do whatever seems best to you," his troops reply. "But," the priest said, "let us inquire of God here. Let's make sure that this is what God wants us to do." So Saul asked God, "Shall I go down and pursue the Philistines? Will you give them into Israel's hand?" But God did not answer them that day. Saul says, something's wrong here. There's sin in the camp. Got to find out who and what it is. "Come here, all of you who are leaders of the army, and let us find out what sin has been committed today. As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if the guilt lies with my son Jonathan." Of course, at this point, Saul knows nothing about this. He must die. But not one of his men said a word. They didn't say a word because they know what has happened. And they know that the king doesn't know. It's kind of like, okay, everybody, let's hold our breaths and just wait until this whole thing blows up in our faces. Saul said to all the Israelites, "You stand over there. I and Jonathan, my son, will stand over here." "Do what seems best to you," the men replied, still holding their breaths. Then Saul prayed to the Lord, the God of Israel, "Why have you not answered your servant today? If the fault is in me or my son Jonathan, respond with Urim," one of the stones, the priestly stones. "But if the men of Israel are at fault, respond with Thummim," the other priestly stone. Jonathan and Saul were taken by lot, and the men were cleared. Saul said, "Cast the lot between me and Jonathan, my son." And Jonathan was taken. And Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me what you've done." Jonathan told him, "I tasted a little honey with the end of my staff, and now I must die." Classic response. This really is falling into no good deed goes unpunished territory. And that was Saul's cue to kind of step back, think twice about what he's been saying, what he's been promising to do. Hey, you've now just put your own son's life at risk here. Any dad would maybe think twice at that point. This is Saul's response. "May God deal with me ever so severely if you do not die, Jonathan. Yeah, you're my son, but hey, it's been nice knowing you. See you on the other side, whatever." But the men here finally speak up. And before things get too crazy here, they said to Saul, "Should Jonathan die, he who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never. As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help." So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. Then Saul stopped pursuing the Philistines, and they withdrew to their own land. Kind of an implicit criticism here, saying that, if it weren't for Saul's leadership, which was lacking in so many areas, they could have done a better job of vanquishing the Philistines. They didn't do too badly. I mean, God enabled them to do what they did, but, if Saul had just been a little bit more faithful to the Lord, they could have been able to do maybe a lot more. And the writer is quick to point out that Saul was not totally incompetent as a military leader, because it points out that after Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies on every side: Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zobah and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment on them. He fought valiantly and defeated the Amalekites. More about the Amalekites in the next chapter, delivering Israel from the hands of those who had plundered them. And then we read a little bit about Saul's family. Saul's sons were Jonathan, who we've already been introduced to, Ishvi, and Malchishua. The name of his daughter was Merib, and that of the younger was Michal. More about her in a later chapter. His wife's name was Ahinoam, daughter of Ahimaaz. The name of the commander of Saul's army was Abner. More about him, son of Ner, and Ner was Saul's uncle. Saul's father, Kish, and Abner's father, Ner, were sons of Abiel. All the days of Saul, there was bitter war with the Philistines. And whenever Saul saw a mighty, or that's hard to say, whenever Saul saw, I have to say that carefully. Whenever Saul saw a mighty or brave man, he took him into his service. And there will be more to come on this in a future chapter. But we're going to stop here because this has kind of set the scene. We've learned a lot about the nature and the character of Saul. He is, at least officially, at least on paper, a man of God. I mean, he's the king of Israel. How much of a man of God we saw revealed today. He was basically a guy who, maybe not a bad guy, maybe a pretty good guy. But when things started going south on him, he started doing kind of silly things. And did he go to God about them? Well, that was not his first instinct. His first instinct was to do everything that popped into his head. And basically waiting until going to God was basically his last and final option. So, I mean, we can critique Saul here, but that is something a situation that many of us, if we're not careful, will fall into. We look at God as the last resort rather than the first resort. And when anything comes up, we really do need to take it to the Lord in prayer. So anyway, next week, we're going to focus on chapter 15 because this is another transitional chapter that we need to look at carefully because it really sets the table for what we're going to see in the rest of 1 Samuel. So if you will, please read chapter 15, take a look at it, and Lord willing, we'll all be here next Sunday and we'll talk about that. Hope you all have a great week. Continue to pray for rain because we're still in a deficit. And be safe and stay warm. We'll see you next Sunday.